The Entity Framework introduced code-first migrations a few releases ago, and migrations allow you to create an initial database, seed the database with data, apply schema changes as your model changes, and also generate database scripts and other nifty features. But you were only allowed to have a single migrations folder in your project, and the migrations only worked with a single DB context. One of the new features for this version of the Entity Framework is the ability to work with multiple DB contexts in the same project that point to the same database and all require some migrations. This is done with a few switches that you apply to the migration commands. There's a -context type name to locate the DB context you want to create migrations for, and also a switch to control the directory where the migrations code will live in your project. And those switches are used with the enable migrations command that you run from the package manager /PowerShell console in Visual Studio. Behind the scenes, the Entity Framework will do everything required to work with multiple migrations, including storing information in the database in a migration history table about which migrations have been applied from where, so it keeps track of everything. Let's take a look at this feature in our application. One way to work with the Entity Framework is just to run this application and let the framework create a database for me using all the defaults. We did that in the Identity module when we had a class derived from Identity DB context. You might remember I went in and I registered a new user. The Entity Framework silently created a database with all the tables needed to store the user, their password, the roles, all the things identity related. With this project, I want a little more control over when the database is created and what schema changes are applied. I want everything checked into source control, and to do that, I will use the migrations feature. And to enable migrations, I need a package manager console. The easiest way to launch the package manager console is to go to that quick launch bar in Visual Studio, search for package manager console, click the link, it'll open up. But before I enable migrations, there's a little bit of unfinished business from the last clip. If I do a build, I currently have an error in the account controller, because the account controller is using application DB context. That is the context that we renamed and moved, so it no longer exists. It is now identity DB. Let me go into the account controller and replace application DB context with identity DB. I also need to bring in the new namespace, which is using books.web.data contexts. And now the account controller will have something that ultimately will query and persist user information. The build now succeeds, and now I can enable migrations. So in the Package Manager console, let me just type the command enable migrations. What migrations will do is go through the project, find all the classes that derive from DB context, and because it finds more than one, it will give an error. I have to be very explicit about which context I want to enable migrations for. Do I want it for BooksDB or IdentityDB? And since I need it for both, I'm going to have to run enable migrations twice, both times specifying a context type name, just like the error says. If I want this for BooksDB, then use -context type name BooksDB. In this case, I think I'll start with IdentityDB. Note that you don't have to specify the full namespace qualified type name. You can just use the class name as long as that class name uniquely identifies a DB context. And if I were to execute that command as is, it would create a migrations folder in the root of this project. That would be fine if I only needed one set of migrations. But I need two sets, one set of migrations for books, one set of migrations for identity. They're going to evolve independently. And although I can have multiple migrations in a project, I can only have one set of migrations in a specific directory. So I don't want a directory at the top level called migrations. Instead, I want to use this new parameter in this version, migrations directory, and specify that I want the migrations for the identity DB to be in data contexts, and that's the folder that we already have in the project. Identity migrations. I will execute that command. It's going to go out and see if there's an existing database using the connection string that DB context specifies. It doesn't find one, so the only thing it will add to start is a configuration.cs file. This is very similar to the configuration files that you would have seen with previous versions of the Entity Framework, but notice that this version includes a property migrations directory, and indeed that will specify the folder where this configuration.cs file lives. It lives inside of a folder called Identity Migrations that's a subfolder of data contexts. And the idea here is that I'll have a folder for the identity migrations and I'll have another folder for the book migrations. So let me run enable migrations again, this time against books.db, and this one I want to call book migrations. Let's run that. Again, it won't find the database. Again, the only thing it will create for me is this configuration class. So now 2 configuration classes, one for books, one for identity. Both of them have automatic migrations enabled equals false. That means I have to be very explicit about any changes I make. When I make a change in my model, let's say I add a property to my book class, later down the road after I've created the database, once I add that property, then I'll have to come in and do an explicit migration and add a migration that will make that change in the database for me. Since I currently don't have a database, I also need to add a migration that will create the initial table structure for me. And I can do that with the add migration command. So add migration now takes a parameter, the configuration type name. That is the type name of the class that you want this migration associated with. Since I want to do identity first, I will take this namespace and copy it and come into the package manager console and say that I want the configuration type name to be books.web.datacontext.identitymigrations.configuration. So that is the name of the class that is currently in the editor window. That's where I want to add a migration called initial create. And I expect when I add this migration by executing this command that it will emit C# code in a class that derives from a DB migration base class that contains a Fluentish API for creating tables. So create a table to store roles, to store users, to store claims. It will set up all the primary keys and foreign keys. It will even add some indexes to make some of the queries efficient. And what we'll see in just a little bit is that this is really an API to wrap SQL DDL statements. So invoking methods inside of here like create table will create an object structure, and later on in the migration processing, that object structure will be transformed into SQL statements. SQL statements like create table. But before we do that, let's enable the initial create for my book migrations. So book migrations dot configuration. I want to execute that. That will generate a C# file, the initial create file that is in the book migrations. This one just needs to create a single table DBO books. The integer ID property will be an identity column. It's the primary key for the table. Title is a string. Notice that it has a max length of 255. It picks up that 255 number from the data annotation that we added to the book class. You might remember we brought in data annotations, said that title was required. That means it's not nullable. And that it had a maximum string length of 255 characters. That information is used for validation, but it also flows into the schema of the database because the entity framework migrations will pick that up. Then notice that category is just stored as an integer. So when you work with an enum, it might be a little bit different than what you expect. You do not get some sort of lookup table that contains ID and description. And there's some pros and cons there. The pros are that it's one less join to do when I need book information. The cons are that I will not have a table in the database that says enum value 4 has a description of science space fiction. Instead, we'll need to do some of that work inside the application itself. But we'll get to that. I now have some migrations that will initially create the database for me. And again, the idea is much later on in the project, when I come back and start modifying the model, add new properties to book, or add an author class that I also want to store in the database, I will create migrations for those changes, which will add new tables, perhaps alter the existing tables to keep everything in sync and allow me to store my C# objects inside of SQL Server. But right now, I just want to create that initial database using these migrations. Currently, there is no database. If I look in the app data folder, there is nothing inside of app data, but hopefully that will change in just a bit because I want to run update database. What update database will do is go out and see if there's an existing database. If there is, it will look inside of a migration history table that is there and apply all of the migrations that haven't already been applied to that database, bring it up to date. Since there is no existing database, the migration system will know that it has to run all the migrations for me, but it does need to know which migrations to run, and again, that will be specified through a configuration type name. So let's do this first for the identity migrations. I will take this string and copy it and say update database. Configuration type name is identity migrations. Let me have that execute. That appears to have been successful. It applied all the migrations. In this case, there was only one. It also runs the seed method every time. We're currently not using the seed method, but now if I refresh in Solution Explorer, there's my database file. We will look at that in just a second. Because I also need to update the database with my BookDB. To do that, I will copy this configuration type name and paste it into another update database statement. And by the way, you can also update databases programmatically. So by writing some C# code that typically runs during application startup, I could also have any migrations execute through configuration that I apply to the web.config file. In this case, I'm just doing everything explicitly through the package manager console. And it's a little more work the first time since I have two migrations going on. But in the future, books will probably change. The identity DB context will probably not change. I will mostly be running update database just for this books configuration. And before I run this one, let me add a flag verbose. That should actually show me the SQL statements that will be sent to SQL Server. And now if I come back and actually type this command correctly, perhaps it will execute and we'll be able to see that one of the statements that was sent to SQL Server was a create table books. ID is an identity, title is an nvarchar 255, category is an integer. So everything appears to have worked. And now I should be able to open up this database. And I should be able to come into the tables and see that we have not only our books table that the books DB context will use, but also all the ASP.NET identity tables that the ASP.NET identity provider will use. And now we have a database that we can start with. And I could create this database anywhere just by changing the connection string in web.config. Currently, it's pointing to this MDF file that is inside of app data, but I could certainly point it to a SQL Server and remove this from my app data folder. We're just going to work with this database. What I want to do next is now create a user interface that will actually allow me to add some books to this books table.